30 minutes before the wedding, a millionaire quietly overheard his soon-to-be son-in-law on the phone, calmly describing exactly how he planned to steal everything the family had spent a lifetime building. The father said nothing. He did not storm in. He did not cancel the wedding. Instead, he and his daughter did something so calculated, so perfectly timed, and so completely unexpected that every single person in that wedding hall sat frozen in their seats. And the man who thought he had fooled everyone walked out of that building with nothing but the sound of silence behind him. Hello everyone, welcome to our story. Before we continue, please don't forget to like this video and subscribe to our channel. Also, tell us in the comments where you are watching from. Are you in New York? Jamaica? Maybe South Africa or Canada? We'd love to hear from you. The morning arrived quietly. It came the way important mornings sometimes do, not with noise or rush, but with a kind of stillness that makes you stop and pay attention. The sky turned from dark blue to soft orange, and the light moved slowly across the Coleman estate like it was reading every corner before deciding to stay. It touched the iron gates first. Then the tall hedges trimmed so perfectly they looked like walls made of leaves. Then the wide stone fountain in the front yard, where water fell in smooth, quiet sheets into a pool below. Then the windows, long, wide windows that caught the morning light and threw it back in warm gold pieces across the lawn. It was the kind of morning that made you believe everything was going to be fine. Richard Coleman was standing on the balcony of the second floor when the light reached him. He was 68 years old and he looked it, not in a tired way, but in the way of a man who had lived every single one of those years fully and without shortcuts. His hair was silver and cut close. His face had lines in it, the kind that come not from age alone but from thinking hard, working long, and carrying things that were never light. He was a tall man, still straight-backed, still solid, wearing a white dress shirt that had already been pressed twice by the time the sun came up. He was holding a cup of tea. He had not taken a single sip. He just stood there holding it, looking out over everything below him. And there was a lot to look at. The estate was enormous, the kind of place that took years to build and even longer to believe was really yours. To his left was the garden, full of white roses and tall green plants that had been arranged by a team of decorators who arrived 2 days ago and had barely slept since. To his right was the outdoor area where the reception would happen later. Round tables covered in cream-colored cloth, glass candle holders catching the early light, chairs lined up in neat rows facing a small raised platform where the wedding ceremony would begin. Everything was in place. Everything was ready. Richard looked at it all and felt something he could not quite name. It was not sadness. It was not fear. It was something quieter than both, a feeling that sits in the chest and does not move. The feeling a man gets when something important is about to change and he does not yet know if the change is good. He had built this estate from nothing. Not from a small amount of money and some luck. From nothing. From a single rented room in a crowded part of the city, a second-hand calculator, a notebook full of numbers, and a stubbornness that people around him used to call foolishness before they started calling it vision. He had started as a financial consultant with no clients and no name. He had worked 7 days a week for years. He had made mistakes, lost money, lost sleep, lost friends who thought he was chasing something that did not exist. But he had not stopped. And slowly, painfully slowly at first, then faster than he could believe, things began to grow. 1 client became 5. 5 became 20. He moved out of the rented room. He opened a small office. He hired his first employee, then his second, then a whole floor of them. He made careful investments, studied markets the way other men studied holy books, and said no to shortcuts even when shortcuts were the easier road. By the time he was 40, Richard Coleman was wealthy. By the time he was 50, he was what people in the city quietly called a serious man, which meant that when he walked into a room, things changed. Conversations shifted. Chairs were offered. Doors opened without knocking. By 60, he had built something that would outlast him. The estate. The businesses. The name. And through all of it, there had been one person beside him. His wife Clara. Clara Coleman had been the kind of woman who made every room feel warmer just by walking into it. She was not loud. She did not need to be. She had a way of listening to people, really listening, not just waiting for her turn to speak, that made everyone who met her feel like they mattered. She had supported Richard through every hard season, celebrated every win like it was the first one, and held the family together during the years when Richard was so busy building that he forgot to be present. He had loved her in the way that a man who does not say much loves, deeply and without performance. She died 6 years ago. A quiet illness that came without warning and moved faster than anyone expected. 1 month she was laughing at the dinner table. For months later she was gone. Richard did not speak publicly about that time. He did not fall apart in front of people. He went to the funeral, received the condolences, thanked every person who came, and then went back to work the following week because work was the only thing he knew how to hold on to when everything else felt like water slipping through his hands. But inside, something had shifted permanently. The estate felt larger than it used to. The rooms felt quieter. And Richard Coleman, who had spent 40 years becoming a man that cities respected, suddenly found himself rattled by the one thing money could not fix: loneliness. But it was his daughter who saved him from it. Not intentionally. Not with speeches or plans or the kind of deliberate effort that people talk about later. Just by being exactly who she was: present, sharp, warm in the way Clara had been warm, but with an edge to her that was entirely her own. Susan Coleman was 28 years old, and from the time she was a small girl, she had been watching. She watched the way her father read contracts. She watched the way he spoke to people in meetings, carefully measuring each word before it left his mouth. She watched the way he handled problems. Not with panic, not with noise, but with the same steadiness that a surgeon brings to a difficult operation. Cool hands. Clear eyes. No wasted movement. And she learned. By the time she was in university studying finance and economics, she already understood things that her classmates would spend years trying to grasp. By the time she graduated, top of her class, 2 academic prizes, a dissertation that her professor later used as a reference in his own published work, she had already spent 3 school holidays working inside her father's company, sitting in on meetings, reading reports, asking questions that surprised the senior staff. When she joined the company full-time, nobody gave her the position because of her last name. Her father made sure of that. He put her in a junior role, gave her a small desk in a mid-level department, and told her to earn her way up the same way he had. Some people in the company whispered about it, thought it was unfair or strange or maybe even cruel. But Susan did not complain. She arrived earlier than anyone else. She stayed later. She made decisions that were better than those of people twice her age, and she did it without drawing attention to herself. Within 2 years, she was running the entire financial operations division. Not because her father promoted her. Because the results spoke for themselves, and the board had no argument left. Susan became Richard's right hand, not just in the company but in life. After Clara died, it was Susan who quietly made sure Richard ate properly. Who called him every evening not to talk about work but just to talk. Who noticed when he was tired before he admitted it. Who sat beside him at Clara's grave on the anniversary of her death every year, not saying anything, just being there. She was his anchor. His peace. His pride. And now, on this golden morning, she was about to get married. Richard finally took a sip of his tea. It had gone cold. He did not mind. He thought about the first time Susan had brought Frank home. It was about 2 years ago. A Sunday afternoon. Richard had been in his study reading when he heard Susan's voice in the hallway, followed by a voice he did not recognize, calm, unhurried, with a laugh that did not try too hard. He had come out to find his daughter standing in the living room next to a man who was looking at the bookshelves along the wall with what appeared to be genuine interest. Frank Thomas. He was 32. Tall, well-dressed without being flashy. Good-looking in a quiet way, not the kind of handsome that announces itself, but the kind you notice slowly. He had a business background, he said. Consulting and investments. He shook Richard's hand firmly, looked him in the eye, and then stepped back and let the conversation breathe instead of filling it with himself. Richard had been guarded. He was always guarded with people who entered his daughter's life. He had seen enough of the world to know that wealth attracted attention that had nothing to do with love, and he had no intention of watching his daughter be fooled by someone with good manners and bad intentions. So he watched Frank. Not in an obvious way. Richard was far too practiced for that. He watched the way Frank treated the household staff. He watched what Frank ordered when he was a guest at dinner. He watched how Frank responded when he disagreed with something Richard said, whether he folded too quickly or whether he held his ground with respect. He paid attention to small things. The small things always told the truth before the big things did. And over weeks, then months, then a full year of careful observation, Richard found nothing wrong. Frank was patient. He never pushed Susan. He never made the relationship feel rushed. He showed up when he said he would. He remembered small details. He was respectful to Richard without being fake about it, not agreeing with everything Richard said but disagreeing the right way with reasons and without arrogance. He was, as far as Richard could tell, exactly what he appeared to be. So Richard had given his blessing. Not easily. Not without long thought. But he had given it. And now, as he stood on the balcony on the morning of the wedding, holding his cold cup of tea, the feeling in his chest that he could not name was getting louder. He put the cup down on the balcony railing. Below him, he could see the catering staff moving between the kitchen and the reception area, carrying trays and boxes. He could see two decorators adjusting something near the ceremony platform. He could hear, faintly, music being tested inside the main hall. Soft, elegant, the kind of music chosen for a moment that is supposed to be remembered forever. Everything was ready. Everything was perfect. So why did something feel wrong? Richard stood there a little longer, listening to a feeling he had learned a long time ago never to ignore. It was the same feeling he had once gotten just before a major investment collapsed. The kind of quiet alarm that does not ring loudly but hums beneath everything else, steady and persistent and impossible to shake. He had ignored it once in his life. Just once. And that mistake had cost him 3 years of recovery. He never ignored it again. He picked up his cup, turned, and walked back inside the mansion. The wedding was 30 minutes away. And something was not right. He walked down the wide hallway of the second floor slowly, one hand brushing the wall as he moved. The hallway was decorated for the day, fresh flowers in tall vases, soft white fabric draped along the railings of the staircase below. Everything smelled like roses and something sweet he could not identify. The house was alive with movement. Staff members crossed from one room to another carrying things. Someone was laughing downstairs. A door opened and closed. A phone rang somewhere and was answered quickly. The whole estate was humming like a machine that had been wound up and set in motion, and nothing about any of it looked wrong. But the feeling in Richard's chest had not gone away. He passed the guest rooms. He passed the small sitting area at the end of the hall. He was heading toward the staircase when he heard it. A voice. Coming from behind a door on his left. The private lounge that guests sometimes used when they needed a quiet moment away from the main rooms. The door was not fully closed. It was open just enough to let sound through, and the sound that was coming through it made Richard stop walking immediately. It was Frank's voice. Richard stood completely still. He was not the kind of man who eavesdropped. In 68 years of living, he had always believed that people deserved their private conversations. He had never pressed his ear to a door or asked someone to report back to him about what others were saying in closed rooms. But something stopped his feet before his mind even made the decision. The tone. That was what did it. Not the words, not yet. The tone. Because the voice coming through that door did not sound like the Frank he had watched carefully for 2 years. It did not sound warm or patient or measured. It sounded like something else entirely. Something flat. Efficient. Like a man talking about numbers on a spreadsheet, not about the most important morning of his life. Richard did not move closer. He did not need to. He simply stood where he was and listened. The ceremony starts in less than half an hour, Frank said. His voice was low but clear. Once it's done, everything moves immediately. Do not wait for my call. Just execute. Pause. He was listening to whoever was on the other end. She's already signed enough, Frank continued. The rest becomes easy after today. Once the marriage is official, the access opens up. We reposition everything before the end of the month, then move all the money. Richard's hand, which had been resting lightly against the wall, pressed flat against it. He did not move. He did not breathe loudly. He just listened. Frank's voice came again, quieter now but still completely calm. The calmness was somehow the worst part. There was no guilt in it. No hesitation. No small moment where the voice dropped or wavered the way a person's voice does when they know they are doing something wrong and feel the weight of it even slightly. Nothing like that. Just cold, clean efficiency. Her dad doesn't even see it coming, Frank said. And then he paused, a short pause, the kind that comes before something important, and added, just like my father didn't. The hallway was completely silent except for the distant sounds of the house going on about its business below. Richard stood still for a long moment. If you had been watching him from the end of that hallway, you would not have been able to tell that anything had happened. His posture did not change. His face did not crumble. He did not make a sound. He simply stood there, a tall, silver-haired man in a pressed white shirt, with his hand flat against the wall and his eyes focused on nothing. But inside, something was happening that had not happened to Richard Coleman in a very long time. He was afraid. Not for himself. For his daughter. He stepped back from the door quietly, carefully, the way you step back from something dangerous, and walked back down the hallway the way he had come. Not quickly. Not running. Because running would make noise, and noise would be the wrong thing right now. Right now, the wrong thing was letting Frank know that anything had changed. Richard went to his study. He closed the door behind him, sat down at his desk, and opened his laptop. His hands as he typed were completely steady. Just like my father didn't. Those words were sitting in the middle of his mind like a stone dropped into still water. He could feel the ripples moving outward from them, touching things he had not thought about in years. Old memories. Old names. Old files. His father. Frank had said his father. Richard pulled up his company's archived personnel records, a secure system he had not opened in years. He typed in his old password from memory. It still worked. He began searching, going back 20 years, then 25, then further. He was looking for something. He did not yet know exactly what. But instinct, the same instinct that had kept him alive in business for 4 decades, was pointing him in a direction, and he had learned to follow it without arguing. He searched for the name Thomas. There was only one. Martin Thomas. Senior financial manager. Hired 23 years ago. Terminated 20 years ago. Richard sat back in his chair. Martin Thomas. The name came back to him the way things come back when you have spent a long time not thinking about them, slowly at first, in pieces, then all at once. A face. An office. A handshake. A man who had been, for 3 years, one of the most trusted people inside Richard's company. Martin Thomas had handled sensitive accounts. He had access to records that very few people could see. He was quiet, professional, well-liked by the staff. And then one day things did not add up. An auditor flagged a number. Richard had it checked. Then checked again. Then brought in an outside firm to look at everything from the beginning. Funds were missing. Not a small amount, a significant amount, moved carefully through several accounts over the course of nearly a year, each individual movement small enough not to trigger an alarm on its own but adding up, over time, to something that could not be explained by accident or error. The trail led back to Martin Thomas. Martin had denied it at first. Then the evidence became impossible to argue with. Richard had fired him immediately and handed everything to the appropriate authorities. The legal process that followed was long and painful. Martin lost everything. His job, his professional reputation, his standing in the community. Richard heard later, through someone who knew someone, that the man had never recovered. That he had moved away. That his family had fallen apart. Richard had not thought about Martin Thomas in 15 years. But Martin Thomas apparently had a son. And that son had spent those 15 years thinking about Richard Coleman. Richard stared at the screen. He thought about every Sunday dinner Frank had attended at this table. Every conversation. Every handshake. Every moment where Richard had watched carefully and seen nothing wrong. He thought about how Frank had never been too eager, never pushed too hard for Susan's attention, never tried too obviously to impress Richard. How patient he had been. How perfectly measured every single interaction had been. Because it was not natural ease. It was practice. Everything Frank had done, every smile, every careful word, every moment of well-timed restraint, had been a performance built on a plan that started long before he ever knocked on their door. He had not fallen in love with Susan Coleman. He had targeted her. Richard closed the personnel file and opened a second window. He called a former associate, a man named George who had worked with him in the early years and now ran a private financial investigation firm. George answered on the second ring. "I need something checked," Richard said. "Quickly. I need everything you can find on a man named Frank Thomas. 32 years old. Father's name was Martin Thomas. I need it in the next 20 minutes. George did not ask unnecessary questions. That was why Richard trusted him. "Give me 15, George said, and the line went quiet. Richard sat at his desk and waited. Outside his study window, he could hear the estate continuing to prepare for the wedding. Someone was giving instructions about the flower arrangements. A car door closed in the driveway. Music drifted from the main hall, still being tested, still soft and perfect and completely unaware. 12 minutes later George called back. What he said in the next 3 minutes confirmed everything that the feeling in Richard's chest had been trying to tell him since he woke up that morning. Frank Thomas had a history that did not match the man they knew. There were shell companies, small, quietly registered businesses with names that sounded legitimate, that had been set up over the past several years. They had no real operations. They existed on paper. And they were structured, George explained, in a very specific way, designed to receive assets that would be transferred after a marriage made certain financial access possible. The beneficiary structures were complex, but the direction everything pointed was clear. This had been done before. Not with Susan. With someone else. 2 years before Frank appeared in their lives, there had been another woman. A woman from a wealthy family in another city. She had met Frank, fallen for him, and within 8 months they were engaged. The engagement had ended suddenly. The woman had discovered something, though George did not yet have the full details, and Frank had moved on. He had moved on to Susan. Richard thanked George, ended the call, and sat for a moment in complete silence. The clock on the wall said there were 17 minutes left before the ceremony. He stood up. He was going to go to Susan. He was going to take her somewhere quiet and tell her everything. He was going to protect her the way he had been protecting her since she was born, calmly, without panic, with a clear plan. He crossed the study, opened the door. And Susan was already standing there. She was in her wedding dress, ivory white, simple and elegant, the way she did everything. Her hair was up. Her earrings caught the light. She looked beautiful in the way that people look beautiful when they are fully themselves, not performing, not trying, just present. In her hand was a folder. She walked past him into the study, set the folder on his desk and turned to face him. Her eyes were calm. Not the calm of someone who did not understand what was happening. The calm of someone who understood everything and had already decided what to do about it. "Sit down, Dad," she said quietly. Richard sat. She opened the folder. Inside were printed documents, contracts, financial records, account registrations, company filings. Richard scanned the first page, then the second. His eyes moved quickly. He had spent 40 years reading documents like these, and within 60 seconds he understood what he was looking at. It was everything George had just told him, and more. There were documents showing the exact structure of the shell companies. There were records of communications, not private messages but formal paperwork trails, that showed how the whole scheme had been built. There was a timeline at the back of the folder, written neatly in Susan's own handwriting, that showed when each piece had been put in place relative to key moments in her relationship with Frank. His first visit to the estate, 2 weeks after a particular financial document became publicly linked to the Coleman Company name. The proposal, 3 days after Susan had signed a routine document that, buried in its language, contained a clause that could be activated under specific conditions after marriage. Everything was calculated. Everything was timed. Richard looked up at his daughter. "How long have you known?" he asked. "I started suspecting 4 months ago," she said. "Something felt slightly off about a document he asked me to review and sign. I didn't say anything. I just started watching more carefully. I confirmed everything 3 weeks ago." 3 weeks. She had known for 3 weeks and had said nothing. Had continued planning the wedding. Had continued going about every day as though nothing had changed. Richard thought about what kind of control that required, what kind of internal steadiness, and felt something in his chest that was beyond pride and beyond words. "I'm not calling off the wedding," Susan said. Richard looked at her. "I know what you're thinking," she said. "But calling it off is not enough. If we call it off, he walks away. He finds the next person. He does it again. And again. The woman before me, she nearly lost everything. I've already spoken to her." She paused. "He doesn't stop, Dad. Not unless he is stopped." Richard was quiet for a moment. "What are you planning?" he asked. Susan looked at him steadily. "I'm revealing the truth about him and ending it at the altar." Richard looked at his daughter for a long moment. He had seen many things in 68 years. He had sat across tables from men who lied to his face and smiled while doing it. He had watched deals collapse and watched people crumble when they did. He had buried his wife, rebuilt himself from grief, and made decisions under pressure that would have broken someone with less practice. But sitting in that study, looking at Susan standing in her wedding dress with a folder of evidence in her hand and a plan already formed in her mind, Richard Coleman felt something he had not felt in a very long time. He felt outmatched. Not in a bad way. In the way a teacher feels when a student surpasses them. In the way a man feels when he realizes that the person he spent his whole life protecting no longer needs protection. Not because the danger is gone, but because she is more than capable of facing it herself. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Tell me everything." Susan sat down across from him and spoke clearly and without rushing. She had first noticed something was wrong 4 months ago when Frank casually asked her to look over a business document he said was related to a minor investment of his. It was long, full of legal language, the kind of document that most people skim rather than read. But Susan did not skim documents. She never had. She read every line the way her father had taught her, slowly, looking for the thing that was trying not to be found. And she found it. Buried deep in the language of the document was a clause. A small one. Easy to miss if you were not specifically looking for it. It referenced a secondary agreement that would come into effect under certain conditions. One of those conditions being the legal union of 2 named parties. The names were not there yet. There were blank spaces where names would go. She had said nothing to Frank. She had handed the document back and told him it looked fine. Then she had started watching. She went back through other documents she had signed in the previous months, routine things, company paperwork, financial authorizations, and began reading them again. carefully, all the way through. And in two of them, buried in language that looked standard, she found similar clauses. Small, specific, designed to activate after marriage. She had already signed them. So she had gone further. She hired her own investigator, someone Frank had never met, someone with no connection to the Coleman Company, and asked him to look into Frank Thomas quietly and thoroughly. 3 weeks later, he had come back with everything that was now sitting in that folder on Richard's desk. The shell companies, the financial structure, the previous engagement, the woman in the other city. Her name was Laura, and Susan had called her personally, introduced herself carefully, and spent 2 hours on the phone listening to a story that made her blood go cold and her resolve go solid. Laura had almost lost her family's savings. She had caught Frank just in time, by accident, stumbling onto a document she was not supposed to see, and had ended the engagement immediately. She had not gone to the authorities because she was ashamed and frightened and did not fully understand what she had found. She had just run. And Frank had simply turned and found the next door to knock on. Susan had thanked Laura, promised her that this time things would be different, and ended the call. Then she had sat in her room for 1 full hour. Not crying. Not panicking. Just thinking. She thought about how carefully Frank had built everything. How much time he had put into it. How he had studied her father, understood their patterns and their trust and their values, and had used all of it, every single piece, as material to build his way in. She thought about the 2 years she had given him. The conversations. The dinners. The moments she had believed were real. And then she had made her decision. Running was not enough. Exposing him privately was not enough. A man who operated the way Frank operated, carefully, patiently, moving from one target to the next with no noise and no consequences, needed to be stopped in a way that created consequences. Permanent ones. Public ones. He needed to be seen. Fully and completely and in front of everyone. By the time she finished telling Richard everything, the clock in the study showed 12 minutes before the ceremony. Richard had not interrupted her once. When she finished, he leaned back in his chair and looked at the ceiling for a moment. Then he looked at her. "What do you need from me?" he asked. Susan almost smiled. That was her father. No argument. No attempt to take over. Just that question, offered the way a soldier offers a hand to someone who is already standing. "I need you to be in the front row," she said. "And I need you to let me handle it." Richard nodded once. "Done," he said. They left the study together. In the hallway they separated, Susan going back toward the bridal suite, Richard going toward the main hall to take his place among the arriving guests. They did not hug. They did not exchange long looks or dramatic words. They simply moved, each of them carrying the same secret, walking in the same direction. And neither of them let their face show a single thing. Downstairs, the mansion was now completely full of life. Guests had been arriving for the past hour, and by now the main hall and the outdoor reception area were filling up beautifully. There were people in elegant clothes moving through the space, accepting glasses of juice and water from staff members, finding their seats, admiring the decorations, taking photographs on their phones. There were old friends of Richard's from his early business years, men and women who had watched him build everything from the beginning. There were colleagues of Susan's from the company, sharp, well-dressed professionals who respected her enormously. There were family members, some of whom Richard had not seen in years, now sitting together and catching up in low, warm voices. And there were Frank's guests. Perhaps 30 of them. People he had introduced over the past 2 years as friends, former colleagues, distant family. They sat on their side of the hall looking comfortable and relaxed, chatting among themselves, completely unaware that the man they had come to celebrate was somewhere in this building making a phone call he should never have made. Richard moved through the room slowly. He greeted people warmly. He shook hands and accepted congratulations with a quiet smile. He asked a few guests about their journeys, whether they had found the estate easily, whether they needed anything. He was unhurried, gracious, completely present. Nobody looking at him would have seen anything unusual. That was the point. But as he moved through the room, his eyes were doing something else entirely. They were tracking Frank. Frank was near the front of the hall, standing with 2 of his guests, looking relaxed and polished in his dark suit. His hair was neat. His shoes were clean. He was laughing at something one of his friends had said, and the laugh looked real, loose and easy, the kind that comes from a man who feels completely in control of his situation. He had no idea that the situation had already slipped out of his hands. Richard watched him for a moment from across the room. Then he looked away and continued greeting guests. But something changed in Frank's manner about 10 minutes before the ceremony was due to begin. It was subtle. Most people would not have caught it. But Richard was watching, and Richard had spent 40 years reading rooms and reading people, and he caught it immediately. Started with a small thing. Frank reached into his jacket pocket, the kind of automatic gesture a man makes when he is checking his phone, and found something missing. Or perhaps not missing, but not where he expected it. His hand stilled for just a fraction of a second before he recovered and smoothed the gesture into something natural. But that fraction of a second was there. Then his eyes moved. Not in the wide, social way they had been moving before, taking in the room, connecting with guests, performing ease. They moved differently now. Quickly. Scanning. The way eyes move when the mind behind them is looking for something specific and starting to worry it won't be found. He was looking for Susan. He found Richard instead. Their eyes met across the room. Richard held the look for exactly the right amount of time, long enough to be normal, short enough to give nothing away, and then turned to speak to the guest beside him, as though Frank was simply one of many people in the room. But in that brief moment of eye contact, Richard saw something pass across Frank's face. A flicker. Not guilt. Not panic. Something smaller and quicker than either of those. The kind of look a man gets when a calculation he was certain about suddenly seems slightly less certain, and he cannot immediately identify why. Richard had seen that look before. He had seen it on the faces of men sitting across from him in negotiations when they realized, too late, that he knew more than he had let on. He turned away and let Frank sit with that flicker. Let it grow. Because that was how it worked. You did not confront a man like Frank directly, not yet, not before the moment was right. You let the uncertainty do its work first. You let the silence press on him. You let him wonder and watch and try to calculate what he could not calculate because the information he would need to calculate it had already been taken away. The clock moved. 5 minutes before the ceremony, the guests began finding their seats. The music that had been testing itself all morning settled into something official and beautiful. Soft strings that filled the decorated hall with warmth. The officiant took his place at the front, calm and prepared. Ushers moved the last few standing guests gently toward their chairs. Frank was directed to the front, where he stood beside the officiant and faced the aisle. He straightened his jacket. He clasped his hands in front of him. He looked composed. But his eyes kept moving. Richard sat down in the front row on Susan's side. He straightened his own jacket, folded his hands in his lap and faced forward. The music shifted. And Susan appeared at the back of the hall. The room responded the way rooms respond to a bride, a soft collective intake of breath, heads turning, the quiet recognition that something important is beginning. She was holding a bouquet of white flowers and she walked slowly, steadily, the way she did everything. But it was her face that told the real story. She was not nervous. She was not glowing with the particular joy that most brides carry down the aisle. She was something else, focused, clear-eyed, and completely in control. If the guests noticed anything, they likely told themselves it was simply her personality. Susan Coleman had always been the composed one. Of course she would walk down the aisle like this. Frank watched her come toward him. And somewhere in those last few seconds as she got closer and he looked into her eyes, his expression shifted. It was small. Very small. But it was there. Because what he saw in her eyes was not what he had been counting on seeing. He had been expecting the face of a woman who loved him and trusted him and believed that today was the beginning of their life together. He needed that face, had built his entire plan around it. Instead he saw something that had no warmth in it at all. Not coldness. Not anger. Just clarity. The kind of clarity that means someone understands exactly what is happening and has already decided what to do about it. Susan reached the front of the hall and stood across from him. The music faded. The officiant smiled and opened his mouth to begin. And Susan turned to face the guests. Her voice, when she spoke, was the same voice she used in boardrooms and financial reviews, clear, unhurried, carrying to every corner of the room without being raised. Before we begin, she said, there is something I need to say. The room went quiet so quickly it was almost startling. One moment there was the soft rustling of fabric, the small sounds of people settling into their seats, the distant clink of something in the reception area outside. And then Susan spoke and all of it stopped. Every sound. Every movement. As though the whole room had taken a breath and decided to hold it. The officiant looked at her with mild surprise but said nothing. He stepped back slightly, giving her the space. Frank did not move. His hands were still clasped in front of him. His face had not broken into anything obvious. No panic, no anger. But the stillness of him was different now. It was the stillness of a man who has just heard an alarm go off somewhere in the distance and is trying very hard to identify exactly where it is coming from before he reacts. Susan reached into her bouquet. It was such a small, calm movement, her hand parting the white flowers with the ease of someone who had practiced it, and she drew out a folded document and held it in front of her. Not waving it. Not making a performance of it. Just holding it the way you hold something that speaks for itself. She looked out at the guests. Most of you came here today because you believe you are witnessing the beginning of something, she said. A marriage. A new chapter. Two people choosing each other. She paused. I need you to understand what you are actually witnessing. A woman near the middle of the room shifted in her seat. Someone coughed quietly and then seemed embarrassed by the sound. Otherwise the silence held. Susan opened the document. This man, she said without looking at Frank, did not come into my life by accident. He did not meet me, fall in love with me, and ask me to marry him because of who I am. Now she looked at him. He came with a plan. Frank's jaw tightened. It was the first visible crack, small, controlled, but there. His eyes were on the document in her hands and something behind them was moving fast. 14 months before he introduced himself to me, Susan continued, turning back to the guests, Frank Thomas registered a series of companies. They have different names, different addresses, different registration numbers. But they share one thing in common. She held up the document slightly. They were all structured to receive assets, large amounts of money, that would be transferred after a specific event. She let that sit for a moment. That event was a marriage. My marriage. To him. The room began to change. It was not a dramatic change, not yet. It was the kind of change that happens in the air before a storm, when the temperature drops slightly and the wind stops and everything becomes very still and very attentive. Heads that had been politely tilted forward were now fully upright. Eyes that had been soft with the warmth of a wedding were now sharp with something else entirely. He identified me as a target, Susan said. Not a person. A target. He studied my father's company, understood its structure, identified documents that could be used, and built a timeline around getting close to me, gaining trust, mine and my father's, and executing a financial scheme that would have moved a significant portion of our assets into accounts we could not easily recover. She turned to the document and read one line from it directly, the name of one of the shell companies and the clause buried in its structure that referenced postmarital asset transfer. I signed 2 documents that contained language connected to this scheme, she said. I signed them before I discovered what they were. That was his window. Today was supposed to close it. Frank spoke. Susan. His voice was low, controlled. The voice of a man who was still trying to manage a situation that had already moved far beyond his management. This is not the place for this. She looked at him. You chose the place, she said simply. You built everything around this day. This room. This moment. You decided that this was where it would happen. She tilted her head slightly. So this is where it ends. He looked at her for a long moment. And then something shifted in his face. Something that was not anger and not guilt but something older and more complicated than either. A kind of exhaustion. The exhaustion of a man who has been carrying something heavy for a very long time and has just been told that he does not have to pretend it is not heavy anymore because everyone can see it. There is something else, Susan said, turning back to the guests. Something that explains not just what he planned but why. She set the document down on the small table beside the officiant and folded her hands in front of her. 20 years ago, a man named Martin Thomas worked for my father's company. He was a senior financial manager. He was trusted with sensitive accounts. Over the course of nearly a year, he moved funds, carefully in small amounts, into accounts that did not belong to the company. When the audit found it, he was fired. He faced legal consequences. He lost his career and his reputation. The room was completely silent. That man was Frank's father. A sound moved through the guests, not a gasp exactly but something like one. The soft collective noise of understanding arriving all at once. Frank grew up believing that my father was the villain in that story, Susan continued. That Richard Coleman had destroyed his family. And perhaps from where he was standing, as a child watching everything fall apart, hearing only one version of events, that is how it felt. She paused. But a feeling is not always a fact. She let those words settle. His father stole from this company. My father did not destroy Martin Thomas. Martin Thomas made a choice and my father responded to that choice with the appropriate consequences. That is not villainy. That is accountability. She looked at Frank again. You spent years building this plan. Years of patience, years of performance. You learned how to speak to people like my father. You learned what to say, what not to say, when to push and when to pull back. You built a version of yourself designed specifically to pass every test a careful man would apply. She took one step toward him. "And you wasted all of it," she said quietly, "on the wrong idea. Your father committed a crime. That crime had consequences. And instead of living forward from that, you turned it into a mission. You let a story that was not even completely true become the reason for everything you did." Frank was looking at her with an expression that was difficult to name. It was not the face of a man who was caught. It was something more complicated, the face of a man who is hearing something he has never quite heard before, in a moment he cannot defend against. "I feel sorry for the child you were," Susan said. "I mean that genuinely. Losing everything at a young age because of a parent's decisions, that is real pain. That is not nothing." She stepped back. "But I will not be the price of that pain. And neither will anyone else." She turned back to the guests one final time. "The documents in this folder are already with the appropriate authorities. His financial operations have been reported and are under investigation. If anyone in this room has had a financial relationship with Frank Thomas, business dealings, investment agreements, anything, I would encourage you to review those carefully. My team is available to help anyone who needs it." She picked up the folder from the table and held it at her side. Then she looked at Frank one last time. "This was never love," she said. "And I think somewhere under everything you built you already knew that." The room held its silence like something fragile. Frank stood at the front of that beautifully decorated hall, in his dark suit, in front of the flowers and the candles and the rows of people who had come to celebrate him, and he said nothing. There was nothing to say. Every argument he could have made required a foundation, and the foundation had just been removed piece by piece in front of everyone. He looked at Richard. Richard was sitting in the front row exactly where he had said he would be. He had not stood up. He had not spoken. He had not made a single dramatic gesture or said a single word throughout all of it. He had simply sat there, upright, steady, his hands folded in his lap, like a wall that had been there the whole time and was not going anywhere. Their eyes met. Richard held the look. And in that look was something that needed no words. Not triumph. Not anger. Just the quiet, immovable fact of a man who had seen everything, understood everything, and had trusted his daughter to handle it, because she could, and because she did. Frank looked away first. He turned. He straightened his jacket once. A small, automatic gesture, the last performance of a man whose performances had run out, and he walked down the side aisle toward the back of the hall in shame. Not quickly. Not running. Each step was measured because even now, even at the very end of everything, some habits do not break easily. The guests watched him go in shame. Nobody spoke. Nobody moved to stop him. And when the door at the back of the hall opened and closed behind him, the sound of it was very soft. Almost gentle. As though even the building wanted to let the moment pass without making more of it than it already was. Susan stood at the front of the hall and breathed. One breath. Slow and deep and quiet. Then she looked out at the faces in front of her, the shock, the confusion, the concern, the slowly settling understanding, and she spoke again. "I know this is not what any of you expected today," she said. Her voice was still steady, but there was something slightly different in it now. Something that had not been there before. A small warmth, the kind that surfaces when the hard thing is done and the person who did it can finally let their shoulders come down by half an inch. "Thank you for being here. The food is still very good, and you have all traveled a long way." A single laugh came from somewhere in the middle of the room, surprised and genuine. And then another. And then the tension that had been holding the air so tightly began, slowly, to release. Richard stood up from the front row. He walked to his daughter, stood beside her, and did something he had not done in public in years. He put his arm around her shoulders. Just that. Nothing more. And Susan leaned into it, not heavily, not like someone who was falling, but the way a person leans into something solid when they are not falling and they know it, but the solidity feels good anyway. They stood there together for just a moment. Father and daughter. At the front of the hall, in front of everyone, in the place where a wedding had just quietly unmade itself. Then Susan straightened up, thanked the officiant, and began moving through the room, speaking to guests, answering questions calmly, making sure the people who had traveled the furthest were looked after. She moved through the shock the way she moved through everything else. With purpose. With grace. Without making anyone feel worse than they already did. Richard watched her from the side of the room. And for the first time since he had stood on the balcony that morning, holding a cold cup of tea and listening to a feeling he could not name, the feeling was gone. Replaced by something else entirely. Something quieter. Something that did not need a name because it was simply the truth, plain and warm and without complication. His daughter was going to be fine. More than fine. He turned and walked to the window at the side of the hall and looked outside, where the reception tables were still set perfectly, the candles not yet lit, the glasses waiting. The morning had fully arrived now. The sun was high and clean and the estate was bright with it. He stood there quietly. And he allowed himself for just a moment to feel the full weight of the morning, what had nearly happened, what had been stopped, what it had cost Susan to hold all of it for 3 weeks without breaking, and what it said about the woman she had become. He thought about Clara. She would have sat in that front row without moving just as he had. She would have let Susan handle it just as he had. And afterwards she would not have said much. She would have simply squeezed Susan's hand and smiled the particular smile she had, the one that said, "I always knew." Richard pressed his hand briefly against the window frame. Then he turned and went to join his daughter. The reception that followed was unlike any reception Richard Coleman had ever attended. It was not a celebration exactly. But it was not a disaster either. It was something in between, a gathering of people who had just witnessed something extraordinary and were still quietly processing it while accepting plates of food from staff members who moved through the crowd with admirable professionalism, as though everything was completely normal. Some guests left early. That was understandable. There were people who had come purely for Frank's side of the occasion, and with Frank gone, their reason for being there had walked out the same door he had. They slipped away quietly in 2s and 3s, with polite goodbyes and uncertain expressions. But most people stayed. They stayed because of Susan. Because she moved through that reception with such steadiness and such genuine warmth that leaving felt wrong, felt like abandoning someone who did not need rescuing but deserved company anyway. She spoke to everyone. She remembered names, asked about children, laughed at the right moments. She ate a full plate of food and complimented the caterers personally. She was extraordinary. Richard stayed close but not too close. He knew when his daughter needed space to be herself, and this was one of those times. He sat at the main table, spoke with old friends, and kept one eye on the room the way he always did, not out of worry now but out of habit. What nobody at the reception knew, what neither Richard nor Susan would discover until much later that evening, was that they had not been the only ones paying close attention during the ceremony. Seated near the middle of the guest rows, between a colleague of Susan's and an older woman who turned out to be a distant cousin of Richard's, was a young man named Kevin. He was 26 years old, a friend of a friend who had been brought along as someone's plus one, and he was not particularly important to the story of the Coleman family. Except for one thing. From the moment Susan had turned to face the guests and said the words, "Before we begin," Kevin had quietly taken out his phone, opened his camera, and begun recording. He recorded all of it. Susan's voice as she laid out the plan piece by piece. The document being lifted from the bouquet. The revelation about the shell companies. The explanation of Martin Thomas. The moment Frank's face shifted. The moment Frank walked away. Richard standing up from the front row and putting his arm around his daughter. Susan's small joke about the food being very good, and the surprised laugh that followed it. All of it. Kevin was not a journalist. He did not have a large following online. He was simply a young man who had just witnessed one of the most remarkable things he had ever seen and felt, in the way that young people feel things, that the world should see it too. He left the reception before it was over, went and sat in his car, trimmed the video slightly, wrote a caption that said something like "You will not believe what just happened at this wedding," and posted it. Then he drove home. By the time he got there, the video had 40,000 views. By the time he ate dinner, it had 300,000. By midnight, it had crossed 2 million, and his phone had stopped being able to keep up with the notifications. By the following morning, the video was everywhere. Not just on the platform where Kevin had posted it. It had been downloaded and reposted on every major social media platform. It was on blogs. It was being covered by online news pages with headlines that people were sharing furiously. Comment sections were exploding with people who had watched it once, then twice, then sent it to every person they knew with a message that said, "Watch this right now." The phrase "she pulled the documents out of the bouquet" was being repeated everywhere. People were calling Susan Coleman brilliant, fearless, a woman who had planned an exit strategy for her own wedding. The video was being watched by people in countries far away from the city where it happened, translated into other languages, discussed in communities that had no connection to anyone involved. And then the other voices started to appear. First it was a comment. A long one, buried under the viral video, written by a woman who simply said, "This happened to me too, different man, same structure, same patience, same plan, I almost lost everything." The comment was liked hundreds of thousands of times within hours. Then another woman posted her own video. She did not show her face. She spoke from behind her phone camera, her voice steady but quiet, and she described a relationship from 3 years ago with a man who fit the same pattern. The engagement that moved quickly. The documents she had been asked to sign. The shell company she had only discovered by accident. She did not name Frank specifically. She did not need to. Everyone watching understood. Then Laura came forward. The woman from the other city, the one Susan had called weeks ago, the one who had nearly lost everything and had run without reporting it. Laura posted a statement on her own account. A long, carefully written statement that named Frank Thomas directly, described exactly what had happened to her, and ended with the words, "I was too afraid to speak then. I'm not afraid now." Laura's statement was shared over 1 million times before the day was out. After Laura, more voices came. Not all of them were women. There was a man, a businessman from another region, who had entered into what he believed was a legitimate investment partnership with Frank 2 years before Frank appeared in Susan's life. He had lost a significant amount of money through a contract that turned out to be structured exactly like the ones in Susan's folder. He had assumed it was his own mistake and had never connected it to anything larger. Now he connected it. By the end of the second day, there were 11 people who had come forward publicly with their own accounts of Frank Thomas. 11 different stories with the same shape. The charm, the patience, the carefully worded documents, the financial structures designed to take everything and leave nothing obvious behind. Investigators who had already begun looking into Frank's operations were now receiving information from 11 directions at once. The picture that emerged was far larger than even Susan's folder had shown. Frank Thomas had been running this scheme in various forms for nearly 7 years. The targets were always the same type: individuals connected to significant wealth, either through family or through their own work, people who were careful and intelligent and therefore required a longer, more sophisticated approach. He had been patient because he had learned that patience was the most effective tool available to a person with bad intentions and good manners. He had caused real damage to real people. And for 7 years he had walked away from all of it without consequences. That was about to change. On the third day after the wedding, the police came for him. Frank had not left the city immediately after walking out of the Coleman estate. That surprised some people later. They expected a man with his level of calculation to have had an exit plan ready. But perhaps he had underestimated the speed of everything that followed. Perhaps he had believed in those first hours that he could still manage the situation somehow. Find a way to reframe it. Speak to the right people. Use the same tools that had always worked. He was at a small cafe, sitting alone at a corner table with a coffee and a phone, the same composed posture he always carried, when the police arrived. There were 4 of them. They came in through the front entrance and the officer leading them was calm and professional. She walked directly to Frank's table, identified herself, and informed him that he was being detained for questioning in connection with multiple financial fraud investigations. Frank looked at her. For a moment he was very still. Then he moved. He was fast. Faster than people expected from a man who had spent 2 years performing stillness and patience. He pushed back from the table, sent the coffee spinning, and went for the side door of the cafe with the speed of someone who had thought about this moment and decided that running was the only option left. He made it through the side door. He made it about 15 steps down the street outside. And then a woman named Grace stopped him. Grace was 43 years old. She was not large. She was not a police officer or a security professional or anyone with any special training in stopping people who were running. She was a woman who had been sitting outside the cafe with her own coffee, enjoying the morning, and who had seen the video of the Coleman wedding 2 days ago and had watched it 4 times because she found it that extraordinary. She had recognized Frank's face the moment he came through the side door. She had stood up from her chair. And when Frank ran past her, she did 2 things with the kind of decisive speed that belongs to people who simply decide to act and do not waste time thinking about whether they should. She stuck out her leg. Frank went down hard on the pavement, catching himself on his hands and one knee, and before he could get back up, Grace sat on him. There was no other way to describe it. She sat on the back of his legs with her full weight, locked her arms around his left ankle, and held on with the grip of a woman who had made a decision and was not changing it. Frank struggled. He said several things that were not polite. He tried to push up and could not, because Grace was firm and completely committed and also furious in the quiet way that women get furious when they have watched something deeply wrong go on for too long. "I saw you on the video," she said to the back of his head, in a conversational tone that somehow made it more extraordinary. "You are not going anywhere." The 4 officers came through the door and around the corner 15 seconds later. They found Frank Thomas face down on a city pavement, being held in place by a 43-year-old woman who was sitting on his legs and had her arms wrapped around his ankle and looked as though she would stay there indefinitely if that was what was required. The lead officer looked at Grace for a moment. "Thank you," she said. "You are welcome," Grace said pleasantly, and stood up and stepped back and straightened her jacket and picked up her coffee from where she had set it on the ground, because she had thought to bring it with her. Frank was handcuffed. He did not speak as they led him to the police vehicle. He did not look around at the small group of people who had gathered on the pavement to watch. He kept his eyes forward and his face still, and it was impossible to tell what was behind it. The police vehicle door closed. And Frank Thomas was gone. The video of the arrest, filmed by 3 different people on the street, none of whom had coordinated with each other, was online within the hour. But the clip that spread the fastest, the one that was shared more than any other, was the 15 seconds that showed Grace sitting calmly on the back of Frank's legs with her coffee on the ground beside her, holding his ankle with both arms, looking completely at peace with her decision. The caption that went with it, written by someone who had filmed it from across the street, said simply, "She saw him on the video and she was not having it." That clip crossed 10 million views before the day was over. Grace gave a short interview to an online news page the following morning. She was asked why she had done it. She thought about it for a moment. "Because someone has to," she said. "And I was right there." Susan saw the arrest footage that afternoon. She was in her home office, working through a stack of documents connected to the ongoing investigation, when a colleague sent her the link with a message that said, "You need to see this." She watched it once. Then she watched the Grace clip. She sat back in her chair and looked at the ceiling for a moment. Then she put her hands over her face, not in distress but in the way a person does when something hits them in a place they were not expecting. The sudden, overwhelming evidence that the world had shown up. Strangers had shown up. People who owed her nothing, who did not know her, who had simply seen something wrong and decided to do something about it. Kevin with his phone in the middle of the ceremony. Laura with her statement that took courage she had been saving for years. The 11 people who had come forward. Grace with her coffee and her ankle lock and her completely calm certainty. Susan sat in her office for a long time after that. Not working. Just sitting. Feeling the full weight of what it means when truth spreads further than you planned and does more than you expected and brings people in from directions you never anticipated. She called her father that evening. Richard answered on the second ring. "I saw the arrest," he said before she could speak. "I saw the woman Grace," she said. Pause. Then Richard made a sound that was almost a laugh, quiet and warm and real. "Your mother would have liked her," he said. Susan smiled. "Yes," she said. "She would have." They talked for a while after that. Not about Frank or the investigation or the 11 victims or the millions of views. They talked about other things, small things, easy things. The kind of conversation that does not need a subject because the point of it is simply the talking. When they said goodnight, Richard sat for a while in his study with the lamp on and the rest of the house quiet around him. He thought about Martin Thomas. He thought about a man who had made a terrible choice and had faced the consequences of it, and about a boy who had grown up in the shadow of those consequences and had turned them into something dark and purposeful and ultimately self-destroying. He did not feel triumph about what had happened to Frank. He felt something closer to sorrow, the particular sorrow of watching someone waste a life on a grievance that was built on an incomplete truth. Martin Thomas had made his own choice. Richard had responded to that choice with the only response available to him. And somewhere between that moment 20 years ago and this morning on a city pavement, a child had grown into a man who could not let it go. That was its own kind of tragedy. Richard hoped, in the quiet of his study, that somewhere in whatever was coming next for Frank, the investigations, the legal process, the long reckoning, there was a possibility of something different. Not forgiveness exactly. Not yet, and perhaps not ever, depending on what the investigations uncovered. But maybe understanding. Maybe the beginning of a different story. He did not know. He turned off the lamp and went to bed. The investigation ran for several months. It was thorough and it was serious, and by the time it reached its conclusions, the full picture of what Frank Thomas had done over 7 years was documented and provable and placed before a court. The 11 people who had come forward became 13 as the investigation progressed, then 16. Financial analysts worked through the structure of the shell companies and produced a clear account of how much had been taken, attempted, and planned. The legal process moved at the pace legal processes move, which is to say not quickly. But it moved. And it went in one direction. Laura received a settlement that helped her recover a significant portion of what she had lost. Several of the other victims were assisted by a fund that was established as part of the legal proceedings. The documents Susan had signed, the ones with the hidden clauses, were reviewed by a specialist legal team and formally voided. Everything that Frank had put in place was taken apart, piece by piece, and the pieces were accounted for. During all of this, Susan worked. She worked on the investigation, providing documentation and testimony wherever needed. She worked on her father's company, which continued to run with the same precision it always had, because Susan did not believe in letting external events become excuses for internal decline. And she worked on something new. She had been thinking about it since the night after the wedding. Since she had sat in her office and watched Grace hold a man down on a pavement and felt the fullness of what it means when one person decides to act and that decision ripples outward further than they will ever fully know. She was thinking about all the people who had not been as lucky as she had been. The ones who had not caught it in time. The ones who had signed the wrong document and not noticed until too late. The ones who had been too ashamed to speak, too confused by the complexity of what had been done to them, too isolated to find help. The ones who were, right now, somewhere in the world, in the early stages of a relationship or a business deal that was not what it appeared to be, and who had no one to call and no way to know what they were looking at. She thought about what she could build for those people. 6 months after the wedding that never was, Susan Coleman opened a firm. She called it simply Coleman Advisory. It was a financial advisory practice, but not an ordinary one. Its focus was specific, helping individuals, particularly those connected to family wealth or significant personal assets, identify and protect themselves from hidden financial threats, predatory contracts, suspicious relationship-based financial arrangements, shell company structures designed to obscure true ownership, the kind of sophisticated, patient schemes that most people did not know existed until they were already inside one. She built a team carefully. She hired people who were sharp and experienced and who understood that the work was not just technical, it was personal. That the people who came to them were often frightened or embarrassed or both, and that the first thing they needed before they needed any financial advice was to feel that someone understood what they were going through and did not judge them for it. The firm operated with a quiet efficiency that reminded people of Susan herself. It grew quickly. Not because of advertising. Susan did not advertise. It grew because people talked. Because Laura told someone who told someone else. Because one of the 16 victims mentioned the firm to a friend who was worried about a contract they had been asked to sign. Because word moved through communities the way important things move, person to person, with urgency and trust. Within the first year, Coleman Advisory had helped over 200 clients identify risks in their financial and legal arrangements. 40 of those clients had found genuine threats, real active schemes of varying complexity, and had been able to address them before any damage was done. 40 people who might otherwise have lost something significant. Susan did not talk publicly about any of them. She did not post about her work or give interviews about her methods. She simply did the work consistently and well and let the results be the statement. She became known in the circles that mattered, not for what had happened at the wedding, but for what she had built afterward. For the integrity she brought to everything. For the steadiness that made clients feel from the first conversation that they were in capable hands. The wedding story still existed online, of course. It lived in the way things live on the internet, permanently searchable, available to anyone who looked. There were still people discovering it for the first time, watching Kevin's footage, sharing Grace's clip. The story had become one of those rare true things that people return to, not just for the drama of it but because it carries something real. Something about truth. About preparation. About what a person can do when they refuse to be a victim of their own circumstances. Susan had learned to make peace with it. The story was not wrong. It had happened. And in a certain way the spreading of it had done genuine good. Had brought people forward who needed to come forward, had created accountability where there had been none, had shown other people in similar situations that there were options beyond silence and shame. She could not control the story. But she could make sure she was more than it. And she was. I hope you enjoyed watching this story as much as I enjoyed creating it. Like, share, and comment on the lessons you've learned. Let me know where you're watching from in the comments below. See you in the next one.